The talk I'm going to give today is really kind of a background to the wreck of Santa Ana Maria, which is a Spanish galleon. Details on the wreck itself and what has come off the wreck and kind of the repercussions of that wrecking really to history and to the Spanish Empire in particular. So it kind of will be a very quick overview of a lot of different aspects, but it's a very interesting story. And I thought, seeing that it's on your backyard here, it might be fitting just to give a detail of it. Right. Now, just to put in context what was, and I must say I am delighted that this is the first time that I've actually had, as part of the audience, a cat. So I'm delighted because I love animals. So I if anybody, spread the word so that we can have more animals. That one. No, he's grand. Maybe he was the ship's cat. You never know. Just to give a context of what was going on kind of in the wider historical European situation at the time, just to give a kind of it'll place in context what was happening and what was so strategic about the loss of the wreck and the taking of the wreck and why it was plundered. Now, I'm a bit hoarse, so I apologize in advance. During that time, which was 1628, you had what was known as the 80 Years' War, which went on, obviously, for 80 years, but it was going on in Europe since the middle of or just past the middle of the 16th century. And it was really the Dutch War of Independence. And it was the Dutch trying to really establish themselves in the global sense from a maritime perspective, fighting their arch enemy, which was Spain. Again, who actually had the control of the world, both themselves and the Portuguese. But when after 1583, when Spain annexed Portugal, it was really the Spanish Empire that had control of the world and the maritime routeways. So other nations like the Dutch were looking to get a piece of the action. There was a truce brokered then up to about 1619 when it fell apart again, and then the Dutch and the Spanish war erupted. So that was ongoing at that time. This tied in, or the 30 Years' War tied in with that whole 80-year war event from 1618 to 1648. And again, that was a war throughout Europe, really. It kind of began as a kind of a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, but it became, as it usually does, a lot more complex than that. And again, you see Spain in control of the Netherlands and the Dutch looking to get back the Dutch Republic and the Netherlands itself. And France also entered the war at that stage to counter the Habsburgs' power. In 1625, then, the Anglo-Spanish War took place between England and Spain. So you had all this going on at the same time, where England, again, joined with the Dutch with the United Provinces to try to assist them in taking power there. So you had this conflict going on in Europe all the time, with the sea and maritime activities being central to that. It was also a time when the world was opening up from a global perspective, from a trade and economic perspective, with the New World being colonized, trade expanding excrementally, and you had again the Spanish with their firm hold on all of that, and you had the other maritime powers in Europe looking to break essentially Spain's hold on that, because really they had the monopoly on pricing, on goods, and what was being charged and how it was being charged. And because with any monopoly, they then also had fairly substantial influence throughout the political courts of Europe. So that was all part of the reason why the other nations were trying to undermine them. You saw the kind of development of the big merchant shipping companies like the Dutch East Indies Company, the VOC as they became known as, the Dutch West Indies companies, which is key to this story. You had in England the East India companies, or what became known as John's Company as well, and they were also in competition with each other, but they were all in competition with Spain. So you had large ships, warships, because they were all armed, plying the oceans of the world, going to the New World, the Americas, the East and the West Indies, the Caribbeans, Asia, and again looking to really try to get a foothold in the spice trade and things like that. Now, because of that, Spain depended hugely on its galleons and its trade ships, because that's how they made the money for their exchequer. And that's how Philip the Second and subsequent to that, Philip III and Philip IV sustained as an empire. They really got the money and the finances to keep going and to sustain their empire through merchant shipping. And they were really from the gold and silver from the mines of Mexico and South America in Potosi. And again, the English and the Dutch were commissioned by their own states, and this is, when I say commissioned, it meant that they were, in a way, official pirates. They were given, their private ships were commissioned to go out and attack their traditional enemies, which was Iberian shipping. And they, in turn, obviously, they would have been classed as pirates then to the Spanish, so it depends on who was interpreting what at the time. So privateering, even though it's a later term, it's becomes kind of synonymous with that period, especially under Elizabeth and then under James. James outlawed privateering, and that's why piracy exploded during the early part of the 17th century. And then with when he died in 1625, his son Charles I took over, and he again legitimized privateering. So you see privateers and privately commissioned ships coming back in, and you see official attacks on Spanish shipping at that stage, both by the Dutch and by the English. Now, just to get into the treasure galleons. The treasure galleons of Spain really, as I say, they had separated the world between them, Portugal and Spain. And then when Spain annexed, as I say, Portugal, it was Spain controlled under the approval of the Pope. So they really had the control of the Caribbean islands, which was the West Indies, the mines in Mexico, which was, of course, huge slave trades here in Acapulco and Veracruz, and also down here in what was the Tierra Firma, or the South American treasure galleons. You had the New World Spain fleet going to Mexico, and you had the Tierra Firma fleet going seasonally throughout the year down to the mines of Potosi in South America, and bringing the silver and the gold back. They would overwinter in is there a pointer on this? Okay, great. They would come back and they'd follow the trade winds. That's how they do it. They'd go out on one set of trade winds and come back on the other. But they would not necessarily overwinter, but they would wait in Havana traditionally for the trade winds to carry them back to Spain. And that's really a strategic stopover for them, and it's key to this story of the Santa Ana Maria as well. So that were the kind of roots of the treasure galleons, as they became known, because these were large merchant ships. They sailed in line. There would usually be 3 or 4 galleons that carried the silver and the gold, and then you'd have all the kind of supporting warships with them, armed merchantmen protecting them. The taking of the fleet then occurred in September of 1628, and it became not only a national event in Holland, as you can imagine, in the Netherlands, but also internationally, because this is the first and only time in the history of merchant shipping that the full treasure fleet was ever captured. There were treasure galleons captured here and there, but this was the entire fleet. So it was quite a coup for the Dutch. The Dutch under Piet Hein, who was the Dutch admiral who was engaged as the head of the West Indies Company's fleet. He was also a former privateer, and he was a hugely accomplished mariner in his own right. He commanded the 32 Dutch ships, and the Spanish themselves had 15 of ships in the treasure galleon fleet of that year. It was the year 1627 that they set out, so it's known as the 1627 treasure fleet. 4 of those were the Spanish galleons themselves, and the rest were made up of supporting vessels. As I said, it occurred in September 1628. The Spanish fleet was under the command of 57-year-old Admiral Juan de Benavides y Bizan. He was hugely influential in the Spanish naval circles and Spanish merchant fleets. He was married into the royal family, so he got away with an awful lot, including being suspected on numerous occasions of embezzling the actual treasures that he was bringing home. And he was quite an operator, really. He was coming back, and he chose to, as usual, to go to Havana, which that's a very bad map, but you can just the capital of Cuba at the time. But they realized that the Dutch were in the area. Piet Hein had sailed out, and it was his task to follow the treasure fleets and try to capture the galleons that carried the silver. Because Piet Hein was in the area with his ships, Benavides decided to keep going down to Matanzas Bay to the southeast, and that's how he ended up in Matanzas Bay. He was intending on beaching his ships or bringing them into shallow water, offloading the treasure for safekeeping, leaving a guard on the treasure on land, and then sailing back out and engaging with the Dutch. And this was his plan by going into Matanzas. However, he was a very arrogant man. He didn't really communicate with his officers on board, his fellow commanders. There was mass confusion. This is all in a report afterwards between the ships, and the men didn't know really whether they were getting off to go on land or whether they were staying on board, and there was mass confusion because he wasn't very clear in his orders. That was underscored by the fact that the pilots on board weren't familiar with Matanzas Bay, and as a consequence, they actually grounded. It was more shallow. It was shallower than they had anticipated, and the fleet, the main galleons, actually grounded. So he was basically stopped in his tracks. And as a result, Piet Hein, all he had to do was sail in and actually capture the fleet, and he did so without any engagement whatsoever. Benavides jumped ship and hightailed it inland, and he left his crew behind. Some of his crew were captured on board and by the Dutch. The rest escaped inland. But he tried to do a runner, but he was subsequently captured. So it was overall a complete fiasco for the Spanish. Of the treasure on board, obviously Piet Hein was smart enough to take all the treasure off the galleons and put them on his own ship. So there was over 12 million guilders, which was an enormous amount of money for the time. But that was to fund the actual Spanish Empire for that year. So they completely lost their annual funding. There were 4 main galleons as part of the fleet. Piet Hein took these, captured these, and he put the rest. He torched the rest so that the Spanish couldn't follow them. And the crews that had made it on land were allowed. He didn't kill any of the crew. He allowed them to go on their way. He was intent on bringing all the 4 galleons back to Holland, but only one made it, the Santa Lucia. 2 were wrecked off Bermuda, and the one we're interested in, obviously, is the one that ended up on our shores. Shouldn't be here at all, really, and it's the story behind that. So that's the kind of background to the taking. This is a contemporary engraving that was done at the time, showing the Spanish fleet inside in Matanzas Bay, and this is the Dutch coming in the harbour. The fleets are listed, and you get the Dutch fleet and the Spanish fleet, and this is thought to be the Santa Ana Maria. So there's even a representation of the ship or the wreck there. Now, another curious link that is highly probable, even though we haven't been able to positively say yes, it's the same man. On the way back to Holland, the ships were separated by storms, and that's why the 2 wrecked off Bermuda. They carried on the Santa Ana Maria and the Santa Lucia, and they again were separated by a storm. And the Santa Lucia, as I say, made it back with Piet Hein to Holland. The Santa Ana Maria was recaptured off the southern coast by an English privateer called Captain Thomas James, in his ship, the Dragon. And he then was going to bring it back to Bristol and claim it as a prize. Now, this may be the same Thomas James, Captain Thomas James, and it most probably is, who's more famous for his Northwest Passage expedition in 1631, for which he published two books. And he's more obviously well known for that. He was an accomplished explorer, mariner, and writer. In the state papers, he first appears in the state papers in July of 1628, just a couple of months before the treasure fleet was captured. And in that entry, it's recorded that the Bristol merchants gave him a commission for his ship, the Dragon, to act as a privateer on their behalf. So there's a high probability that we're talking about the same man. The reason I'm a little hesitant to say it is that there's actually nothing written in connection that we found so far that links Captain Thomas with the Santa Ana Maria or the treasure, the taking of that, which is curious considering that it was so high profile, the whole taking of the fleet. So that's why there's a little doubt there to say for sure, but it is probably him. Now, the Dragon was taking the Santa Ana Maria back to Bristol, but another storm hit, and he made a decision that he should bring it into Castlehaven and ride out the storm in there. Another kind of a curious link, if it is Captain Thomas James, is obviously Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner is thought to be based on his exploits in the Northwest Passage. So, and he suffered greatly that hardship during that passage, as you can imagine. So it's another link with the wreck here that maybe the same privateer was influential in that. So that's our link to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Anyhow, hit by a storm, he miscalculated the depth coming into the harbour, and that's recorded, and they went up on the rocks on the eastern part of Reen Point, and that's how they ended up wrecking in Castlehaven, just out at the very point here. That's our archaeological map. Of course, Castlehaven would have been very well known through the centuries. It was known as Porto Castillo in the 16th century, where the O'Driscolls had their castle up in the harbour here, and here actually. So mariners would have been using this frequently. So that's probably another reason why Captain James chose to go in there. And of course, it was the scene itself of the famous Battle of Kinsale, Sea Battle of Kinsale in 1601. So quite a lot of shipwrecks recorded for this area. The Santa Ana Maria is just down here, just as you go in, not quite under the little beacon there, the light, but quite close by. Now, we have, from the High Court of Admiralty papers, one of the Dutch mariners he was a lieutenant on board the Galleons, was kept on board by Piet Hein to basically captain the ship on their way back to Holland. And he was still on board when the ship wrecked in Castlehaven. And now, when I say it wrecked, it kind of grounded and wrecked. Everyone got off. They were able to take they took all whatever was left of value off, and it was only the mundane material that's left on it. And now, when they realized that they were in shallower water than they had anticipated, they started unloading the guns out on the outer harbour. So they dropped guns all along the outer harbour to try to lighten the ship. So a lot of them were brass guns. There's iron guns there as well. Lieutenant Frenson wrote an account of that, and that's how we know how the ship was lost, who was on it, that the actual treasure had been taken off by Piet Hein, and then a whole series of legal proceedings, and it's a very interesting case, ensued after that straight away, because you had the local Admiralty officials. James Salmon was one of them. Here, he's signed his name. This is from his account in 1629. James Salmon is linked directly with pirates of the earlier years because he was brother-in-law to Thomas Crook, who had established the settlement in Baltimore. And he was Deputy Vice Admiral there, and he was very much colluding. So he did a whole inventory of material that they took off the ship before it completely wrecked down in Castlehaven, which is a hugely valuable document because it gives us an idea of what was on the ship at that time. So they took off, I'll just read it out there, 34 brass guns, 12 iron guns, and 400 muskets, 6 anchors, all the cables associated with that, and gunpowder. There was Campeche wood from Mexico, materials. There was a sea chest taken off it, probably belonging to the lieutenant or one of the higher up captains on the ships. And then there was various spices as well, indigo, cochineal, etc. So there was quite a lot taken off that was of value. And that's why subsequently the court cases ensued, or the legal proceedings. You had the West Indies Company, who basically felt that because they had captured the entire fleet, they had a right to the material that came off it. You had James Salmon on behalf of the Admiralty claiming it for the Lord High Admiral in England. You had local interests from Freak, from Castle Freak was also interested. He's written on it at the time, trying to lay claim to it. You had Captain James Thomas, of course, looking to be, I suppose, salver in possession as the privateer who subsequently recaptured it. So you had all these vested interests looking for the right to wreck, as it were. The court cases eventually found in favour of the West Indies Company, but not before they had an additional encumbrance in the form of Jacob the Diver. He was a Dutch salvage diver, well known at the time. Jacob Janssen was his name, and he was famous before this for a lot of the salvage on the Armada wrecks, the 1588 Spanish Armada wrecks. He came over himself because he was a private individual that would be commissioned then either by the state or by a private company. And he, again, recovered more from the ship, 20 brass ordnance, 1 iron gun, and again, a local agent, probably Freak, paid Jacob Janssen or Jacob the Diver for some of the material. The guns were taken to Eindhoven, which was an open port at the time in Holland, and there was a huge market. That was the main market for ordnance, ship's ordnance at the time, so he sold them there. As I say, the petition, there's petitions in the state papers from the West Indies looking for basically the guns to be brought back and the material to be taken off of Jacob Janssen. I'll read it out for those of you who may not be able to read it. Petition of the West Indies Company of the United Provinces, a Spanish galleon captured by a ship of the petitioners, was about December 1628 cast away at Castlehaven in Ireland by order of the Council in September 1628. Free passage was granted to all ships of the petitioners, they're the West Indies Company, with right to all wreck of their vessels cast away in His Majesty's dominions. They have ever since laboured for recovery of their wrecked goods at Castlehaven by Jacob Janssen, Jacob the Diver, and lately come hither and taken away wrecked goods made ready for removal by the petitioners' workmen. So at the same time of Jacob Janssen salvaging, the West Indies had their own salvers there. So there was a lot of salvaging going on at the time in these quite amazing these are just indicative. You put down a bell with 2 individuals in it that feed air. Now, there must have been huge loss of life because the air would have been pretty stale and carbon dioxide build-up. And this is another where this guy looks like he has a big I don't know what it is, balloon on his head, and the air is pumped from the surface and he's raising cannons that way. So there were various means of raising, but certainly Jacob the Diver was the most successful at it at the time. Now, my next, they found, just to complete that, they found in favour of the West Indies Company, and Piet Hein was vindicated, and they had to hand over the material that was taken off the ship from Castlehaven. Whether they got, we don't know if they got anything back from Jacob Janssen or the guns or whatever, but certainly because they went to Eindhoven, there's a chance that because that's in Holland, they probably got some of it back. So a lot of material has come off the ship at the time and was taken off the ship at the time, not least the bullion itself which made it back to Holland with Piet Hein. So the next part of my talk, I'm just going to give a history of the discovery of the wreck and relocating of the wreck. And just to preface it, because this is where I come in, my job as part of the State Underwater Archaeology Unit, all wrecks over 100 years old, rather, are automatically protected under Section 3 of the 1987 National Monuments Act. And a license is required to dive on any wreck, therefore, and there's serious penalties not to have a license if you're diving. So we do issue licenses. They're free. They're visual inspection only. They're look, don't touch licenses, so they're not onerous. And they do allow for survey and exploration in that respect, but non-invasive survey, obviously. So the Santa Ana Maria is a protected shipwreck, one of 18,000 that we have recorded for around the country. The wrecks were discovered in the 1970s, and that's key because this predated the 1987 Act. So the divers who recovered material at the time weren't breaking any laws because there was no law there to break. Now, they were artifacts, and under the 1930s National Monuments Act, they should have reported these because the artifacts had been in the law since the 1930s. And again, another large amount of material was raised, especially small material. There was several guns, bronze guns raised. These are them up on the shore at the time. They're from the National Museum of Ireland files in Castlehaven, right up our Castle Townsend. Also, Mr. Ogden from Baltimore was kind enough to get in touch through a friend of mine, Mary Jordan, a couple of years ago, and he had taken photographs at the time, which are of huge value, of one of these guns coming into Baltimore. He was just walking on the pier at the time. And so we know this is another gun that came in at that time through Baltimore and shipped off in O'Brien's lift hire. I've been on to them since, but they're not too inclined to talk to me to see where the gun went. Anyhow, so part of my job is being a detective. And they went into private collections because, again, as I say, they predate the 1987 Act. Some of the divers at the time contacted the Spanish government and they sold material and they gave 10% of that to the Spanish government. So again, all legal at that stage. This is one beautiful piece in a living room of one of the divers. This is again from the National Museum of Ireland files. And we know this comes from the Santa Ana Maria or from the 1627 Spanish fleet because of the crest on the gun. You can see it here. Beautiful crest. And what it says is it has the crest lion, the lions of Leon, the arms of Castile, of Ferdinand and Isabella, the shield of Bourbon family, and then Don Pacheco, he was the Captain General of the Artillery. It says Philip Ray III there. So we know it was directly from the Spanish galleon, and this kind of helped positively identify it as the Santa Ana Maria. A testament to the quality of the craftsmanship of these guns. When this gun was brought up, the divers took an angle grinder to it to shine it. Took about 8 millimeters off, but they still managed. It was still of such good quality that it came up beautifully. As I say, some guns were sold, unfortunately. Others were sold after the 1990s. They were in keeping till then. And that postdated the 1987 Act, which was illegal. So the National Museum followed it up, found some of them in Midmar Castle in Scotland, and got one of them back, which is now in the National Museum. So this is another gun from the Santa Ana Maria on display next to the Spanish Armada Trinidad Valenciana gun. However, when you consider that the divers did a very good job in conserving this one, in fairness, and you see the quality of it and how it's in such good condition because they desalinated it. Now it's bronze, so it's easier to do in one sense. Took the salt out of it so it didn't, and prevented what's called bronze disease from eating it. Fortunately, the divers that had this didn't, and it's in ragged order. You see it all torn away there. The lifting dolphins have been all worn away, so it's a pity, but it just kind of highlights what can go wrong if you lift this material without having due regard for the actual artifact and what it needs to conserve it. So from the inventory, just to give you an idea, At the time, Nessa O'Connor, a colleague in the National Museum, engaged with the dive, a father and son team, Stan and David Woosnam, who had been the original discoverers of the wreck and had raised a lot of the material. Other divers came in then, and there was a big fallout, tried to go in and salvage their own stuff and recover their own stuff, and that's when the guns came up by the other set of divers. So there was a big fallout at the time in the 1970s, and going right up in the 80s and the 90s. But the Woosnams handed over all their material to the National Museum. So it was a hugely, in a way, a good thing to do, because they didn't need to, because a lot of it was taken up before the 1987 Act. But it's the real kind of beautiful stuff now that we have to give us an idea of life on board the ship. And what's even more of value is the inventory that was done at the time by James Salmon on behalf of the Admiralty actually lists what came up, so we get an idea of what was on board the ship, and then some of the material brought up by the Woosnams ties in with what's on the inventory. So it's really archaeology through history in the best way it can. Yes, here it says Spanish bedsteads. One Spanish bedstead. And some of the stuff that came up in the woodlands, the top posts of bedsteads. So we can now, these are ornate, so we can assume that these were part of the officers' beds, because the ordinary crew would have had hammocks themselves. So again, it's looking at these that are now in the collection of the National Museum. You kind of get a direct link of what was going on at the time, the men on board, the inventory that was done, and it's a real kind of a tangible link to that period when you're looking at the material. And candlesticks, of course. Again, from the artifacts handed over, a lot of stuff from the galley, because the more mundane stuff was left on the wreck. They had no interest in it. Or what was down in the lower hold would have been underwater, and they were of no value, really. So, but they're huge value from us, from a kind of a social perspective of life on board the ship. A lovely sieve, galley sieve in 3 parts. Now, again, they weren't given any conservation. The reason that they're intact in any shape or form is because they're copper. But you can see that they're highly eroded in places, and the handles have fallen off. So again, it kind of highlights that this recovery doesn't work. Not if you want, it needs to be done archaeologically with a conservation strategy in place. Recently, myself and through Hiram Morgan, Dr. Hiram Morgan in University College Cork, Mr. Woosnam again, David Woosnam, his son, his father is long passed on, contacted us and said he actually came across, he didn't realize it, he had a couple of more artifacts he found in the garage. So I went down and I collected them on behalf of the state. And they include spoons, lovely pewter spoons, this lovely pot intact. Pewter, it's porous now, all right, but it's still intact. A lot of olive jar rims came up, and these are interesting in themselves, because they're very much a type of olive jar that dates to that early period. You had 4 different categories of olive jars, and Colin Martin of the Spanish Armada fame. Dr. Colin Martin, he's the underwater archaeologist who discovered and worked on most of the Armada, has categorized these. And these tie in very much with these central 1622 type of olive jars. And we can compare them with other shipwrecks as well and look at the different typologies. A lot of ceramics, fragments of ceramics were handed over, but they give a wide spectrum of the types of ceramics, like Maiolica ware, ordinary utilitarian wares. So you wonder if they were part of goods that were being traded, or if they were just being used by the mariners on board the ship. So again, just nice examples of what was on board. This fragment of a lovely, either a bucket or a delicate, it's very delicately carved. It's in 3 sections. This one is slightly curved there. I just photographed it to give an idea of the curve. But again, could have been more. This could have been intact on the seabed, but of course the divers wouldn't have thought to actually excavate in any coherent way. So with we don't know what the damage was done by the recovery of those artifacts either. The ship obviously was armed, and there's quite we know by the guns that it was armed, beautiful guns on board, but also the smaller munitions. Loads and loads of cannon shot and flattened cannon shot, which means they were engaged in, because this isn't part of their cargo, this is from being fired on by other ships that have hit the ship. So we know at some stage it was engaged, or musket shot, it was engaged in some conflict. So they can now, because a lot of mariners would have died from lead poisoning, because the musketeers would line up their musket shots in here, and a lot of the musketeers' remains have holes in their gums, and they've died from lead poisoning because they don't realize they're being poisoned every time. And it just made it quicker to load their guns. And what they found in a lot of battle sites now, they're actually getting DNA from some of these and tracing it back. Now, because this is underwater, they probably wouldn't, obviously, but it just goes to show the level of information you can get if you do an excavation properly. And this is in the museum on display, actually. This is, this is a musket rest, a lovely musket rest. And again, we know they had 5 or 6 muskets on board, and they would have had their attendant musket rests. So again, it just gives us information about what these were. They had muskets on board, and 5 or 6 of them were brought up or taken off at the time of the inventory. So they had more, and obviously they didn't take all of them, and this is one of the ones that was left. So again, it's just kind of giving us an insight into the musketeers. Slingshot, the type of shot they had for engagement in battle. This is what it would have looked like. Slingshot and chain shot. This is chain shot, part of chain shot there, and slingshot. So these would have been for basically destroying rigging. They would have been shot out of the guns, and they'd swivel and they'd rip through sails. So that's what these were used for. But you can imagine the destruction if they hit people. And different types of cannonballs, different sizes, different types. This again is slingshot, or chainshot rather. The actual hook for it is gone. This is a curious item. This is a cannonball, but it's a bronze cannonball. It's porous. At least it looks like a cannonball. There's holes in it. It looks like it probably was a test piece, maybe with some bronze left over. But it's quite unique at the moment. But it's very heavy as well. But I've never come across a bronze cannonball. Different stone shot and iron shot as well. So they were using different types of shot. And lifting dolphins that have been either lobbed off or deliberately lobbed off to decommission the cannons, which they may have done before they threw them into the sea, so that anyone who brought them up couldn't use them. And they used to do this to the trunnions, and they do this to the lifting handles as well. So it basically decommissioned the guns, and others who raised them then couldn't be used. This is not from the Santa Ana Maria, it's from the Trinidad Balancera, but just to give you an idea, they could be on the back of the guns or they could be on the top of the guns. And of course, the true function of the ship. These are lead weights. They fit into each other. They're lovely, 3 of them, and then some more lump weights. Really, these were used for weighing and measuring the actual silver and gold that they got in the mines at Tritosi. How am I doing? Oh, I better go. Okay, so we're getting all types of information from the material that was brought up. I'll just skip through the rest. We know from the list there was lanterns on board, and here's a frame from one of the lanterns. Leather shoe. To us archaeologists, this is amazing. To a lot of divers, this is mundane material. It doesn't shine, so they're not interested. We have examples from other contemporary ships, like the London and the Vasa from 1628. And we have a leather piece from the Santa Ana Maria that was cut, and it was shoe leather. This beautiful piece, of course, the Dutch were the leading, and the Spanish were the leading cartographers of the time. And this little part of a compass, the wooden legs are missing, but it still works. Mr. Woosnam said that he dropped it and it opened up, so that's how he realized it worked. But it's a beautiful bronze piece. And the bell. We don't get too many bells from shipwrecks. This is it's in 3 parts. It broke. Mr. Wozenham tried to stick it together, but it didn't work very well. But it's bronze, so it's fine. There's no name on it. Very similar bell has been recovered from the 1622 Tortugas bell by Odyssey Marine Salvage Explorations. So we do have comparative material from that period as well. So it's a lovely item. Unfortunately, this part of the bell is missing, so they never recovered that. So it's a lovely idea that this was, maybe this was the last sound before the ship wrecked down off Castlehaven. Around the area there's other materials. Just to highlight this large anchor up in Came Hill, Mrs. O'Mahony. I don't know if she's still with us or not. Is she? She's a great character. My God, just think she's an artifact in herself, she's lovely. I've spent 2 or 3 days visiting her. But she said this came from the wreck, but she didn't know exactly where, but it could have come from one of the wrecks in Castlehaven, possibly the Santa Ana Maria. So there are potential, and we know from the accounts of the divers in 1970s that another iron cannon was raised at the time, and it was in a local house, but we don't know where it went to after that. So there could be more out there, basically, is the point I'm making. We did a couple of exploratory dives in it a couple of years ago. There's not much to see. There's iron cannon. There's a huge ballast mound of stone where the ship grounded and landed on the bottom. And there is some very fragmentary timber sticking out from the reef there. It's a highly dynamic zone in high weather, so there's not an awful lot left, unfortunately. But that being said, there's never been a proper scientific investigation of the wreck site, so I reckon we will find a lot more on it, a smaller material particularly. We did do geophysics. There's 2 iron guns visible on the site. They're highly concreted, and they're very hard to find because they look like rocks, but they are there along with the ballast mound. We did do our marine geophysics along the outer harbour just to see if we could find any of the cannons that were thrown out, and we didn't get to dive there. Unfortunately, we were called away on other sites, but we did come across anomalies out in the outer harbour, and this is just a view of the seabed. There's one anomaly there, just to give you an idea, which we hope at some stage, or I hope at some stage, to go back and do spot diving on. So we may find more guns in the outer harbour. Now, just to conclude, to go back to 1628, 1629, and what it meant for both parties, the Dutch and the Spanish. The Dutch, Piet Hein was hailed as a national hero. The local publications or newspapers at the time writes about the taking of the fleet, the only fleet ever taken in its entirety. There's an account of him sailing up the river with the Santa Lucia and the 12 million guilders of silver, and to a hero's welcome. And he made a point at the time. He's noted for saying that he had a long maritime career. He had been involved in some of the most prestigious engagements, and he said, "It's amazing that I capture one Spanish treasure fleet, and I'm hailed a hero. And when I went through all the maritime engagements for my country, they didn't even know I existed." So he was I would say thinking about the way. Fabulous indeed were the captured treasures of silver, gold, and pearls, indigo, sugar, Campeche wood, and costly furs, which sold in the Netherlands for no less than 15 million guilders. This was what was recorded at the time. And they even recorded them in 1800s. They were still composing songs and poems about it. One famous one is, Have you heard the news about the Spanish fleet?" where they sing about Piet Hein and his capture. So very much a major coup, as you can imagine. They even minted in 1629 a commemorative medal showing the Matanzas Bay capture and the account of it from some of the bullion that was taken from the silver taken. So again, this was sold, I think, at auction a couple of years ago for a vast amount. So the Spanish, on the other hand, you can well imagine, broke their empire because they didn't have their exchequer funding. And where Piet Hein was claimed a hero. They, in the archives of Seville accounts, who can hear of this and not seize high heaven itself, and in angry hands, who, at the risk of 1,000 lives, if he had them, would not avenge so grievous an affront. The Hollander has so degraded us that it commonly, in adjacent kingdoms where formerly they called us Spaniards unchained, the Spaniards unchained lions, they now call us embroidered Marias, who with braided hair and padded legs. So hugely demeaning. Juan de Benavides de Bizan, the admiral, was arrested. He was kept in jail secretively in different places for years, right up to 1634, for a number of years, for 6 years in horrendous conditions, because he was so influential, particularly with the nobles in Spain, that Philip feared that if anybody knew where he was, they'd either rescue him or the nobles would make depositions on his behalf to try to get him off. But Philip was fairly determined. This was Philip IV. And in 1634, he was paraded, not unlike Napoleon in the 1800s, backwards on a donkey to his place of execution, which was Alcazar in the public space in Alcazar in Seville. And he was stripped of all his finery. He wasn't allowed to wear his uniforms or his medals. I think the only thing they allowed him to hold in his hand was his medal from Santiago de Compostela, and he was summarily garroted from the back. So that was his end, and it was ordered by Philip IV of Spain, and this is what Philip said: "This is justice. This is the justice that the King our Lord and his royal councils ordered done to this man for his lack of care and the loss of the New Spain fleet taken by the enemy this past year of 1628. He who did so, thus shall he pay." So he was making sure that there was a huge public exhibition of the execution. All his Benavides his prowess as a commander didn't matter. He was basically executed because he shamed the nation. He was disloyal because he didn't command properly. He was cowardly because he jumped ship, and he brought dishonor to his king. What it meant for Spain, they were broken. They lost their foothold on the East Indies trade. Their exchequer was empty. Their ships went into... they came back, of course, but not in the same level. What it did do for the Dutch, it funded not only their exchequer, it funded their army for another 8 months. They captured the famous fortress of Horten-Genbosch, striking, which was a serious blow to the Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War. And it also funded their navy and merchant fleets, where basically that was the beginning of the Dutch becoming the leading maritime empire from that time on in the Atlantic and globally. So that's it.